When I was younger, my family moved into an old house at the edge of a small town. The house was large and a bit run down, with creaky floors and drafty windows. It was the kind of place where the wind seemed to have its own voice, whispering through the halls at night. But what really stood out was the basement. From the moment I saw it, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The basement was accessed through a heavy wooden door in the kitchen, leading down a narrow set of stairs. The light switch was at the top of the stairs, but even with the bulb lit, the basement always seemed unnaturally dark. It was large, cold, and filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and random items left behind by the previous owners. The air down there was thick, heavy, and had a faint, musty smell that never seemed to go away. We rarely went down to the basement. There was no need. It was just a storage space, and most of the time it was best left undisturbed. But there was always something about it that bothered me. I could never shake the feeling that the basement was more than just a room below the house. It felt like something was lurking down there, something that didn't want to be found. It started with small things, objects going missing or turning up in strange places. At first, it was easy to dismiss them as the result of a forgetful mind or just the quirks of living in an old house. But then the sounds began. Late at night, when the house was silent, I would hear noises coming from the basement. It was subtle at first, just faint creaks and groans that could have easily been the house settling. But soon, the sounds grew more distinct. Footsteps, whispers, and the sound of something dragging across the floor. The noises were always worse at night, and they always seemed to be coming from directly beneath my bedroom. There were times when I would lie in bed, too scared to move, as the sounds echoed up through the floorboards. It felt as if something was pacing back and forth, just waiting for the right moment to come up the stairs. I mentioned the noises to my parents, but they dismissed them as my imagination. They said it was just an old house making old house sounds, and there was nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, the sounds became impossible to ignore. It started as the usual creaks and groans, but then I heard something different. 3 loud knocks, echoing up from the basement door. It was unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. Gathering every ounce of courage, I got out of bed and crept down the stairs. The house was dark and quiet, except for the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. As I reached the kitchen, I saw the basement door at the end of the hall, standing slightly ajar. My heart raced as I approached the door. I could feel a cold draft seeping out from the crack, and the air was thick with a strange, metallic smell. I reached out and gently pushed the door open, peering down into the darkness below. The light at the top of the stairs was on, casting long shadows down the narrow steps, but the rest of the basement was pitch black. I stood there, frozen in place, as I listened to the silence. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. But then I heard it again, a faint whisper, coming from deep within the basement. It was too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone or something was down there. Against every instinct telling me to turn and run, I started down the stairs. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the sound of my heartbeat loud in my ears. The air grew colder with every step, and the darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed to swallow the light. When I reached the bottom, I stood still, my eyes straining to see anything in the darkness. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I could feel my skin prickling with fear, but I knew I had to keep going. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my hands brushing against the cold, damp walls. The basement felt larger than it had any right to be, as if the walls had expanded to make room for whatever was lurking in the shadows. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, with long, thin limbs, and its head was tilted to one side, as if it was watching me. The air around it seemed to pulse with a cold, malevolent energy, and I could feel its eyes boring into me, even though I couldn't see its face. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. The seconds stretched on, each one more unbearable than the last. Finally, I did the only thing I could. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my room, with the covers pulled tightly over my head. After that night, I refused to go near the basement. The sounds continued, growing louder and more insistent, but I blocked them out as best I could. I didn't care what was down there. I just wanted to be as far away from it as possible. Eventually, I convinced my parents to move. They still didn't believe me about the basement, but they couldn't deny the fact that the house had started to feel oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. We left the house behind, and I never looked back. But the memory of that figure in the basement has stayed with me, haunting my dreams and lurking in the back of my mind. I don't know what it was or why it was there, but I'm certain of one thing: it was watching me, and it wanted me to know it was there. To this day, I avoid basements whenever I can. I don't care how well lit or harmless they seem. There's always a part of me that wonders if something is waiting down there in the dark, watching and waiting for its chance to be seen again. The house we moved into was old, with a history that seemed to cling to its very walls. It was a large, sprawling place, full of creaking floorboards and forgotten corners. The basement was one of those corners, a space we hardly ever thought about. When we first moved in, we had explored the house from top to bottom. The basement, however, felt different from the rest of the house. It was more than just a storage area. It was a place that felt deliberately forgotten. The entrance was a heavy metal door, unlike any other in the house, tucked away behind the kitchen. Opening the door revealed a steep, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was thick with dust and a musty odor that spoke of years of neglect. The light switch was at the top of the stairs, but it only dimly illuminated the space below. The basement was cold, the walls lined with old brick, and the floor was uneven, with patches of stone visible through the dirt. While exploring the basement, we discovered something peculiar. A second door, nearly hidden behind a stack of old boxes and covered in cobwebs. It was a small, wooden door, almost child-sized, and it seemed out of place in the otherwise stark, utilitarian basement. Curiosity got the better of us, and after clearing away the debris, we opened it. The door led to a small room, barely large enough for a person to stand in. It was completely bare, with no furniture, no windows, and no apparent purpose. The walls were made of the same old brick, but the mortar between them was crumbling, giving the room an even more neglected feel. There was something unsettling about it, something that made us close the door quickly and pretend we hadn't found it. For weeks after finding the hidden room, strange things started happening. It began with faint noises, whispers that seemed to come from within the walls of the basement. They were so quiet at first that it was easy to dismiss them as the wind or the house settling. But as time went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Late at night, when the house was quiet, the voices became impossible to ignore. They were muffled, like a conversation taking place just out of earshot, but there was no mistaking the tone. They sounded urgent, almost desperate. The voices seemed to be coming from behind the walls, specifically from the area around the hidden room. No one else in the house seemed to hear them, or if they did, they didn't mention it. But for me, the voices were inescapable. They grew louder whenever I was alone in the house, filling the basement with an eerie, persistent murmur that made my skin crawl. One night, the voices became too much to bear. They were louder than ever, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to confront whatever was making the noise. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. As I descended the stairs, the voices grew louder, clearer. They were no longer just whispers. They were full sentences, spoken by multiple voices, overlapping and jumbled. I could hear them coming from the hidden room, as if a group of people were trapped inside, trying to make themselves heard. The door to the hidden room was slightly ajar, just as we had left it. The voices were loudest there, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was just as empty as it had been when we first discovered it, but the voices filled the space, echoing off the bare walls. I stepped inside, holding the flashlight in front of me, but the beam of light revealed nothing. There was no one there, nothing that could be making the sounds I was hearing. Yet, the voices persisted, their words still impossible to understand, but their tone unmistakably urgent. In the corner of the room, something caught my eye. A loose brick in the wall, slightly dislodged. The voices seemed to be coming from behind it, growing louder the closer I got. Without thinking, I reached out and pulled the brick free. Behind the brick was a small, hollow space, just large enough to fit a box or a bundle. I reached inside and pulled out a small, dusty object wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping it revealed an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. As soon as I touched the book, the voices stopped. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. I stood there, the book in my hands, and for a moment, I felt completely alone, as if the house had emptied itself of all life except for me. I brought the book upstairs and began to examine it more closely. It was old, much older than the house, with pages filled with handwritten notes and strange symbols. The writing was difficult to read, the ink faded and the handwriting almost illegible, but I could make out bits and pieces. The book seemed to be a journal, written by someone who had once lived in the house, or perhaps before the house had been built. The entries were fragmented, disjointed, but they spoke of a ritual, something that had been performed in the basement, in that very room I had just been in. As I read, a sense of unease settled over me. The journal described the creation of the hidden room, built specifically for the ritual, and the voices were mentioned often. They were the voices of those who had been sacrificed, trapped in the walls, their souls unable to move on. The last entry was the most chilling. It spoke of the book itself, warning that it was the key to unlocking the voices, to setting them free, or binding them forever. The writer had hidden it away, hoping to end the curse that had plagued the house, but they feared it was already too late. The discovery of the book left me with a terrible decision to make. The voices had stopped when I found it, but I knew they could start again. I didn't understand everything that had happened in that house, but I knew enough to realize the danger of the book. I couldn't leave it where someone else might find it, but I couldn't destroy it, either. The voices might be quiet now, but I knew they were still there, waiting. I had to do something to ensure they stayed that way. Following the instructions in the book, I performed a simple binding ritual. It was nothing dramatic, just words spoken over the book, along with a few symbols drawn in chalk. The book didn't respond, and the house remained silent as I carried out the ritual. Once it was done, I wrapped the book in the cloth again and placed it back in the hollow space in the basement wall. I replaced the brick and left the room, closing the door behind me. As I did, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if the house had finally been set right. We moved out of the house shortly after that. I never told my family about what I had found, and they never mentioned the voices. But I still think about that basement, about the hidden room and the voices trapped behind the walls. I know they're still there, waiting in the dark, bound by a ritual that may not hold forever. The basement was a place of secrets, of things best left undisturbed. I was lucky to escape, but I know not everyone is. Some doors should never be opened, and some voices should never be heard. When I first moved into the old Victorian house, I was captivated by its charm. It was a house with character, filled with antique fixtures, creaky wooden floors, and a sense of history that was almost tangible. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold stories within its walls, waiting to be discovered. The basement, however, was different. Unlike the rest of the house, which was warm and inviting, the basement was dark, damp, and filled with an overwhelming sense of unease. It was cluttered with old furniture, dusty books, and various odds and ends left behind by previous owners. The walls were lined with shelves, but what caught my attention the most were the paintings. There were dozens of them, all leaning against the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. The paintings were old, their colors faded, but there was something about them that drew me in. Each one depicted a different scene: a forest at night, a deserted road, a crumbling house, but they all shared a common theme: an eerie, almost oppressive atmosphere that made it difficult to look away. I hadn't intended to spend much time in the basement, but the paintings intrigued me. There was something almost hypnotic about them, something that made me feel as though they were watching me as much as I was watching them. The more time I spent in the basement, the more I noticed strange things about the paintings. At first, it was subtle. A shadow in the corner of one painting that seemed to move when I wasn't looking, or a figure that appeared in a scene where there had been none before. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of spending too much time in a dark, musty basement. But then the changes became more pronounced. One night, while examining a painting of an old mansion surrounded by trees, I noticed a figure standing in one of the windows. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The figure was small, almost childlike, and it was staring out of the window directly at me. Disturbed, I moved to another painting, a desolate landscape with a lone tree in the foreground. As I looked closer, I saw a figure standing beneath the tree, half hidden in the shadows. It was the same figure from the previous painting, and once again it was looking directly at me. I began to notice the figure in other paintings as well, always at the edge of the scene, always watching. It was as if it was following me from one painting to the next, its presence growing more pronounced each time I looked. The paintings began to take a toll on me. I found myself unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of the figure, always watching me from the shadows. During the day, I would hear faint whispers coming from the basement, as if the figure in the paintings was trying to communicate with me. The whispers grew louder over time, becoming a constant, insistent murmur that I couldn't ignore. I tried to stay away from the basement, but it was as if the house itself was pulling me back, urging me to confront whatever was lurking in the paintings. One night, unable to bear the whispers any longer, I went down to the basement with a flashlight in hand. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dampness, and the beam of light revealed the paintings, lined up along the walls like silent sentinels. As I walked past them, the whispers grew louder, almost frantic. I stopped in front of the painting with the lone tree and the figure beneath it. The figure was clearer now, its face more defined. It was a child, no older than 7 or 8, with hollow eyes and a blank expression. The child's gaze was fixed on me, as if it was waiting for something. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew something was about to happen, something that I wouldn't be able to explain. Without thinking, I reached out and touched the painting. The moment my fingers made contact with the canvas, the room was plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me standing in pitch blackness. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence behind me, something that had stepped out of the painting and into the real world. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. The darkness was complete, oppressive, but I could still feel the eyes of the figure watching me, even though I couldn't see it. Then, the whispers returned, louder than before, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices. They were unintelligible, overlapping, but one word stood out, repeated over and over: free. I realized with a jolt that the figure, the child in the paintings, was trapped. It wasn't just a part of the artwork. It was something real, something that had been imprisoned in the paintings for who knows how long. And now it wanted out. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed the painting and ripped it from the wall. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as I carried the painting up the stairs and out of the basement. I could feel the presence following me, growing stronger with each step. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I needed to get rid of the painting. I took it outside, into the cold night air, and set it down in the middle of the yard. Without hesitation, I grabbed a can of lighter fluid from the garage and doused the painting, then struck a match. The flames caught quickly, and the painting began to burn. As it did, the whispers turned into screams, filling the night with a sound so terrible I had to cover my ears. The figure in the painting writhed and twisted, its form distorting as the canvas blackened and curled. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the screams stopped. The painting was reduced to ashes, and the presence that had haunted me for weeks was gone. The air was still, the night silent once more. I stood there, watching the last embers of the fire die out, feeling a strange sense of relief. Whatever had been trapped in the paintings was gone, freed from its prison. I had no idea what it had been or why it had been there, but I knew I had done the right thing. After that night, I never heard the whispers again. The basement felt different too, still cold and damp, but no longer oppressive. The remaining paintings, though still eerie, seemed to have lost their power. I left them where they were, not wanting to disturb whatever other secrets the house might hold. But I never forgot the figure in the painting, the child with hollow eyes, and the terrible feeling of being watched. Even now, years later, I can't look at a painting without wondering what might be hiding beneath the surface, waiting to be set free.